Before we jump into this podcast, let's just have a first word from our sponsors, NordVPN, the fastest VPN in the world and an absolute essential travelling companion. You can use NordVPN on 10 devices with just one account, easily switching your virtual location to access apps and websites in other countries. But if you're out of the country, make sure that you've got NordVPN to be able to use your subscriptions and watch the live sport that you might miss. If you're at home, use it to see if you can save money with products that might be cheaper in another region. Go to nordvpn.com/Manchester to get 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. The link is also in the podcast description.
Hello and welcome to the first edition of the Samuel Luckhurst Show. And I, of course, am Samuel Luckhurst. This is a new instalment that we've added to the Manchester is Red podcast on a weekly basis. Honestly, it's not my idea. It's those above me who've come up with the idea and with the name of the title. So apologies to Gary Neville, who pioneered his own podcast named after him. But this is the very first edition of the Samuel Luckhurst Show. We're recording this on Monday afternoon, day after Manchester United won 1-0 at Fulham. A vital and gutsy win, of course, for United. Myself and Tyrone Marshall were at the game. There were a few of us, in fact, that travelled down from Manchester, from the northwest, for the match, of course, where it was a 7 p.m. kickoff on a Sunday night. Some colleagues had additional commitments in London. So there must have been about 6 or 7 of us who are renowned anyway for writing about Manchester United, who have spent a good portion of their careers writing about Manchester United, who are in attendance at the very quaint Craven Cottage for United's 8th successive victory at Fulham, which is a pretty remarkable record. They've not lost there since December 2009. I was in attendance that day as well. That's how long ago it was. And they had a back three that day. Fortunately, that wasn't an inauspicious omen going into yesterday's game, where they actually kept a clean sheet with the back three. I think it was only the second clean sheet that United have kept under Ruben Amorim. Craven Cottage, for any United fan who's been there in the away end, the Putney end, you'll know what a wonderful little ground it is. There are some cracking watering holes by Putney Tube Station that United fans, away fans of other clubs tend to frequent. And then they make the walk through Bishop's Park. It wouldn't have been quite as pleasant a walk last night, given the kickoff time and the inclement weather. But in better conditions, it's lovely walking by the Thames and up to frankly a beautiful football ground. It's probably my favourite ground in the top flight or in English football in general. And it does help from United fans' perspective if they're winning there as regularly as they have been. It, of course, was not a cracking game. It was not a spectacle. I think the rights holders probably got their comeuppance for inconsiderately foisting that kickoff time onto the Manchester United fans who travelled down from Manchester, of course, which there have been more than 2,000 with the allocation they had in the Putney end. United won with only their only attempt on target. That's the second week where they've only had one attempt on target and it's gone in. Of course, against Brighton, it was Bruno Fernandes's penalty. Lisandro Martinez got the goal yesterday. And I said on the podcast on Friday that Martinez coming into the final third, that needs to happen a lot more often. You saw the benefit of it at Anfield when he intercepted Trent Alexander-Arnold's slack pass, and then he made himself available and couldn't have hit the ball any better when he leathered it past Alisson for United's first goal at Anfield in more than 6 years. He did brilliantly for Bruno Fernandes's winner against Rangers in the 92nd minute last week, where he took the ball just outside Rangers territory. Wonderful crossing. I think everybody's noticed since Martinez first came to United that his passing makes him as much of an asset in attack as he is an asset as a defender, where, of course, he's a real combative presence and his reading of the game is very assured. And of Erik ten Hag's signings, he has been easily one of the better ones. And he's had a iffy season, but there have been some performances of late which would indicate that he's getting back to, if not close to, that form that he displayed in his first season, where he was pretty totemic after a rather wretched start in those matches against Brighton and Brentford. And of course, he got a slice of luck with a goal against Fulham. It was a deflection off Samuel Luckhurst. Bernd Leno got a hand to it when he probably should have kept it out still. I mean, Leno does let in an awful lot of savable shots. He did so against Bruno Fernandes last season for United's winner. and the ball kissed the crossbar and went in. And Martinez has had the good sense to get these goals, having only scored once before this month. He's now got 2 this month, and they've both come at away grounds in front of the away end, and he's made a beeline for the United fans, and he pretty much made their day on those 2 Sundays in January. On this occasion, it was a winning goal. Of course, at Anfield, it was the opening goal of that pretty enthralling 2-2 draw that it ended up. And Martinez, he's obviously having a decent run of form at the moment, despite United's form still not being where it needs to be. But on a personal level, I think it's pretty safe to assume that he will be among the Player of the Month contenders. For those of us who made the trip down, it was frankly, for the large part of the game, it was not riveting as it wouldn't have been for anyone at home. Sir Jim Ratcliffe certainly didn't look particularly entertained in the stands, although I suspect he was sitting in his seat rather uncomfortably, given what was being chanted about him from the Manchester United supporters at Craven Cottage. And I think it was possibly an hour in, and we'd noticed that none of the starting players had been serenaded, but United fans had been chanting Ruben Amorim's name repeatedly. A friend who was at the game in the away end said afterwards, again, the manager doesn't acknowledge us, doesn't come over to us. And I wrote a couple of weeks ago how Amorim decides or doesn't want to acknowledge the supporters in victory or if there's been a positive result, but he will acknowledge them if there's been a negative result. And of course, yesterday, it wasn't a positive performance, but it certainly was a positive result. Fulham had lost only 1 in 11 games before they hosted United, and they are still above them in the table as well. Had they beaten United, they'd have gone 10 points clear. So that's how vital a win it was for United. And when Amorim hears that support for him, it of course emboldens him. And really, the trip down to Craven Cottage was worth it alone for the final question of Ruben Amorim's press conference, which it centred, of course, on Marcus Rashford. And those of us who travelled down had obviously discussed Rashford among other things, and it did feel like some additional clarification was required where he trained on the Wednesday, and in terms of the training imagery and footage that United released, that has been quite scarce since Amorim came in. But certainly since the Rashford and Garnacho incidents on Derby Day, where they were dropped from the squad, there have hardly been any, There have hardly been any occasions where United have pumped out training imagery or footage, and they seem to be doing it on a weekly basis earlier in the season under Erik ten Hag, when of course their form was not good, results weren't going well. But it's that awful word that I hate, content, and I think a lot of other people in the industry hate it as well. But there is an appetite for content, and if you're working for Manchester United, an easy win, of course, is footage and images from training sessions because they have the access to it. But there have only been a handful of occasions where that's happened under Amorim. I think it's 5 occasions now. 3 have revolved around Europa League games where there's a 15-minute open session that the photographers and the press are allowed to observe, and that usually just comprises of watching the players doing their keep ball exercises and maybe some shuttle runs as well, some keepy uppies possibly. And the other 2 occasions were Amorim's first training session, which was back on, I think it might have been November the 18th. It was, of course, the week beginning. At the end of that week, he would manage United for the first time at Ipswich Town. And the other occasion was after they got the 2-2 draw against Liverpool at Anfield, which, although they could have won it at the end, it was a positive result. It was a positive performance. There was an awful lot to be pleased with if you were of a United persuasion. But these scant images from training have, of course, coincided with Marcus Rashford's matchday squad exile. And the last batch of these of these photographs and footage that were released from a session that was not related to a Europa League match, Rashford didn't feature in them. He was conspicuous by his absence. Yet then on Wednesday, as we're walking onto the pitch, someone comes hurtling past myself and Rich Fay, formerly of this parish, of course, and it's Rashford, and he caught us all a bit unawares. And if anything, he actually looked the keenest of anyone to get out on the training pitch. But then the next night, United have a Europa League tie against Rangers. They're permitted to name up to 12 substitutes. So you think, well, logically, Rashford would be picked. I mean, he was picked against Newcastle last month, but he wasn't. It was just 9 substitutes that Ruben Amorim listed. 2 of them were goalkeepers. And of course, there was a lot to pour over in the post-match press conferences, and there was a post-match press conference and there was a pre-match press conference that was held on the same night for the Fulham game because of the Thursday-Sunday schedule. And Rashford was touched upon, but I can't remember the phrasing of the question. It didn't feel like it was a particularly seismic answer that Amorim gave. And what you notice with Amorim is that if you ask him a question, he does endeavour to give you a good response and a lengthy response. And if he doesn't like the question, he will give it short shrift by being short. He won't be necessarily monosyllabic, but he will condense his answer. It'll be one or two sentences at the very most. So when Rashford was brought up at the very end of his press conference last night, and it was signalled by the press officer that it would be the final it would be the final question, you did wonder what's he going to do here. But the way it was phrased was key, because it was pointed out how hapless, frankly, Rasmus Højlund and Joshua Zirkzee have been in front of goal. Højlund's gone 11 games without a goal. He was substituted before the hour mark last night. Zirkzee's gone 9 games without a goal. And so Amorim it was framed to Amorim that you've got someone who has scored goals for you in the past. These two aren't scoring goals. Why isn't he coming back in? And then, of course, he gave that very detailed answer. And there was a little bit of back and forth as well between Amorim and the journalist, Mark Ogden, who of ESPN, who, of course, has covered United for a long, long time. He's not on the dedicated United beat now and hasn't been for a while, but of course he's an authority on United, and he put the question on Amorim. So the question was, you mentioned Højlund struggling for goals, and Zirkzee has scored only 1 in 14 games. Is there any way back for Marcus Rashford, who obviously has a proven record, but hasn't played for your team for 11 games now? And Amorim said it's always the same reason. And then he was asked, quite naturally, what is the reason? And he said the reason is the training, the way I see what a footballer should do in training, in life, and it's every day, every detail. So if things don't change, I will not change. And then Mark came back to him saying, if there's no change to the situation after the transfer window, what's going to happen there? And at that point, he said that Amorim acknowledged it would be beneficial to have Rashford involved, because if you look at United's bench yesterday, they had a lack of pace. That's what he cited. But then, of course, he came up with that Zinger quote, which was, I prefer it like that. I will put Vital before I put a player who doesn't give the maximum every day. So I will not change in that part. And when we heard that, we all, after Amorim and the press officer had left the room, we said to each other, who's Vital or Vital? And there was a message that was sent to the press officer. And I can't remember if the press officer got back to us before or someone else just Googled Vital or Vital Manchester United. And of course, it's the goalkeeping coach, George Vital, who is also 63. So in terms of the profile of backroom staff member that Amorim could have chosen to suggest that he would rather pick him than Marcus Rashford, he chose someone who's in their 60s and is a goalkeeping coach, which is about as far removed a profile you could get from Marcus Rashford as a 27-year-old forward slash goal scorer. And for us, this is great because it's box office. It's the second week running. Amorim has given us a quote that has to be splashed all over back pages and some of the front pages of the sports supplements as well. And what it's apparent that what Amorim is doing here is that he said to us recently he is blunt, but he's also trying to get a message across to the hierarchy, which is that you cannot leave me saddled with this player, because Marcus Rashford has not played for United in the past 11 games. 2 days after he was dropped for the derby, he gave an interview where he outlined his desire for a new challenge. So Rashford wants to leave. His coach wants him to leave as well. And Manchester United have somehow got to facilitate that now, because otherwise their season could unravel, because there's an unsustainable working relationship there between Amorim and Rashford. And the fans are, of course, voicing their support very vocally for Amorim. And the added complication here is that there has been far more noise in recent weeks about the possible sale of another academy winger who is starting for Manchester United, who's being talked up by Amorim in press conferences and whose name the fans chanted last week. And so the prospect of Alejandro Garnacho being sold by United this month, and Ruben Amorim being saddled with Marcus Rashford beyond this month, beyond the closure of the transfer window on February 3rd, is just abhorrent for United fans, because it just doesn't make any sense. There's no rhyme or reason. There's one player who's out of the team because he wants out and his manager wants him out. There's one player who's in the team because his manager wants him in. And he is speaking very, very positively about him, very thoughtfully as well. I mean, Garnacho was brought up in the press conference yesterday, and Amorim admitted that he's still trying to find the best position for him. But he said that where he's playing as one of the two tens behind the striker, sometimes he can play wider, sometimes he can play more inside. And Garnacho's only 20. He's got a high ceiling. He's still learning on the job, even though he's a very experienced Manchester United player, having made his debut not far from coming up to 3 years ago now. It would be April 2022 when he came on under Ralf Rangnick against Chelsea. So he's got a hell of a lot of experience already. He's an Argentina international. He's played in 2 FA Cup finals. He's been involved in cup wins. He's been involved in huge disappointments with United as well, of course, given some of the dreadful results they've accrued since Garnacho came into the team. He's been disciplined by 2 different managers as well, of course. You go back to Erik ten Hag's first pre-season tour. Garnacho didn't play because he was late for a team meeting. He was disciplined last month on the day of the derby when he was ordered to train at Carrington on the morning of the game, along with Rashford. And since then, Garnacho has gone in one direction and Rashford has gone in the opposite direction. So it'd be totally illogical of United, despite the mitigation of PSR, the profitability and sustainability rules, and Garnacho is eminently the more sellable asset. There are takers for him in Chelsea and Napoli, but the prospect of United selling Garnacho at a cut price just for PSR and risking being saddled with Rashford, and even if they were to get Rashford out as well while selling Garnacho, nobody has faith in them that they would sign an upgrade, which is another problem altogether. And this is why, as I wrote on Saturday morning, this is the biggest week yet for Omar Barada, the chief executive of Manchester United, and Jason Wilcox, the technical director, because looking at it from the outside, United need at least 2 signings. They need an attack-minded left winger / left back / left wing back, whoever that may be, whether it's Patrick Dorgu or re-signing Alvaro Fernandez. And they need a forward, who actually scores goals, because the 2 strikers who they've got, who they spent 108.5 million on in successive summers, they're not scoring goals, and they struggle to score goals. We saw that with Højlund last season. We've seen that with Højlund and Xerxes this season. It was dreadful planning by the club in that summer of 2023 to commit so much money. In the case of Højlund and Mason Mount, they spent something like 100 or committed to investing 132 million pounds on those 2 players. Now, Mason Mount was never a central midfielder, and United bought him for their central midfield. Rasmus Højlund was never a proven goalscorer, and they needed a proven goalscorer. So that's on the past regime and their incompetence. They really dropped the ball that summer. But of course, the current regime have not had a good start whatsoever, and that you obviously must have seen, I'm sure, the videos that circulated last night of a handful of United fans confronting Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who rather naively thought that they wanted a picture with him, which would suggest that he's still rather out of touch with Manchester United matchgoers, in particular the away day matchgoers, who really do that is the real truest gauge of supporter sentiment. To quote that infamous former club employee Phil Lynch going on about his sentiment graphs all those years ago. But you don't need a sentiment graph to gauge the fact that Manchester United supporters are very unhappy with Sir Jim Ratcliffe at the moment. And as I said, we're speaking on the Monday. The transfer window closes at 11 p.m. next Monday. Unfortunately, it's going to be a hectic week for us, covering all these deals, whether there are any comings or goings. It is going to rumble on. We could see it coming from the outset that there was no way Rashford was going to be moved quite early on in the transfer window, that it was always likely to go down to the wire, and that still feels like it's going to be the case. But United have got to get him out somewhere or other. I suppose the one concern with what Amorim said yesterday would be that he's weakened United's bargaining hand, where he's demeaned Rashford by suggesting that he'd rather put a 63-year-old goalkeeping coach in the team than a 27-year-old who was the Sir Matt Busby Player of the Year only a couple of seasons ago, and has achieved an awful lot in his career despite having a rather dreadful 18 months. So there have been some conversations between Rashford's camp and certain clubs. From what I was told, his representatives were pitching him as a striker to Tottenham and West Ham, two clubs who are looking to sign a goal scorer or a front man. The complication, of course, is Rashford's salary, 325 grand a week, there or thereabouts. And United haven't got Real Betis to pay all of Antony's salary. United could save up to 84% on his salary while he's there on loan. Antony's on 200 grand a week, which is obscene enough. Rashford's on quite a bit more than that. And there are very few clubs who can foot that bill. And Premier League clubs, they are pretty petrified of these PSR rules. There was an example last season where Crystal Palace were looking at a young defender playing at Rochdale in the National League called George Nevitt, a Wales youth international, and were prepared to pay a rather modest sum of something like £600,000 for him. But then the Premier League announced PSR charges against Nottingham Forest, I think it was at the time, and of course the Everton points deduction had already come into effect, and it scared Palace off, and Palace didn't go ahead with the deal, and George Nevitt ended up signing for League One Peterborough United in the summer. So that's how drastically things can change from a winter transfer window to a summer transfer window. And frankly, PSR just spooked Palace, and they thought, well, it's better to keep money tight and keep a lid on things and wait until the summer. And of course, they sold Michael Olise for a relatively reasonable fee to Bayern Munich. I think it was £50 million or £60 million. And of course, they avoided selling him to a Premier League club. So they're never going to be directly harmed by Michael Olise as long as he's playing for Bayern Munich, unless they come up against him in a friendly, of course. And PSR is one of the buzz phrases at United at the moment, or buzz terms, because they're invoking it at every corner at the moment regarding their activity or inactivity in the transfer window. Amorim is definitely frustrated by the inactivity, as I wrote on Friday. That story went live, I think, late Friday morning or Friday afternoon, and the policy of selling to buy, it's not ideal either, but it is logical. United have a pretty big squad. If they want a left back, they should be looking to get rid of Tyrone Marshall. They can't get rid of Luke Shaw because he's still out injured, and he's going to go more than a year without starting for the club. So they'll do well to sell Luke Shaw in the summer if they indeed look to do that. And in terms of their strike force, they are light in attack, and they're lighter now that Antony has gone on loan to Real Betis. But Antony only started 3 games this season, 1 in the League Cup, 2 in the Europa League. His only goal was in the League Cup, a penalty against Barnsley of League One. Some would say he found his level with that goal, or scoring against Newport County of League Two in the FA Cup last season. So it doesn't really change the dynamics too much, where Antony was such a bit part player. And you could make that argument for Rashford as well, where he's been in exile for the past 11 games. That said, it increases the workload on the other forwards in the team. They've got Ahmad, who up until recently was a bit of a one-man band. Bruno Fernandes, of course, has occupied one of those 2 playmaker roles. Alejandro Garnacho, is he staying? Is he going? That is still up in the air. Rashford's future is still up in the air. So it's not stable. It's not a stable squad whatsoever. And that's a big problem for Ruben Amorim. It's a really tricky next 7 days coming up for United, because they have a lot to play for still this season. All of a sudden, a top half finish doesn't seem as remote as it did before kickoff yesterday. If they'd lost to Fulham, they'd have gone 10 points behind them. Fulham are a 10th, so 10 points off a top half place. That would have been possibly a new low for the season, but that's not the case anymore. They've got 2 trophies to play for. You look at the FA Cup and you think, given how buoyant United must be after getting past Arsenal, and they've been given a kind home draw against Leicester in the 4th round. Good teams have been drawn against each other in the 4th round and will knock each other out as well. So suddenly they've got to feel pretty bullish about their chances of defending the FA Cup. The Europa League is an eminently winnable competition as well. The 2 favourites are United and Tottenham, two clubs that are having rather desperate seasons in the Premier League. Tottenham are 15th now, would you believe, and have plumbed to new fathoms that even United haven't this season. United could have been 15th at kickoff yesterday, but results at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium and Villa Park went in their favour. So that's how winnable the Europa League is. And you look at the other clubs who are high up the bookies' jalk board for favourites. You're looking at Lazio or Eintracht Frankfurt or Athletic Bilbao, whose stadium hosts the final in May. They're not exactly daunting teams. You might have some daunting atmospheres there, going to Rome possibly or Frankfurt, but United may avoid playing those teams altogether, and that's why it's so important for them to get into the round of 16 automatically by getting a positive result against FCSB in Bucharest on Thursday. If they get to the round of 16 by finishing in the top 8 of the Europa League table, then they've got 3 midweeks in February and they've not got a two-legged playoff, which is absolutely what Ruben Amorim wants to avoid, because as he said so many times now, having those closed weeks where he can just coach the players within an inch of their lives, it's having a big impact. You saw that at Anfield and you saw that at the Emirates Stadium, probably the two best performances under Ruben Amorim. Not even probably, in fact, they are the two best performances under Ruben Amorim. They came after United had a 6-day or a 7-day gap between games. So that's the huge benefit of it. And next month, I think they've got 5 games, which are starting on Sunday. It's Palace at home. Then it's Leicester at home in the FA Cup. Then Tottenham away. Then Everton away, and then the month ends with a midweek match at home to Ipswich Town. If they were to have a playoff, then 5 games become 7, and that's 7 matches within, I think it would be something like I think it would be a 24-day period. So 7 matches crammed into 24 days. That's an extraordinary amount of football. You rewind 2 years ago to February 2023, and United played 8 matches in 26 days in that February, and they did brilliantly. They won 6, they drew 2, I think they ended the month 3rd in the Premier League table because they were unbeaten. They, of course, progressed past Barcelona in their Europa League knockout tie, and they ended the month by winning the League Cup final against Newcastle United. And really, that was the apex of the club under Erik ten Hag. After that, it was quite a gradual decline, unfortunately, for United and their manager at the time. They're under a new manager now as well, of course, with Ruben Amorim, and it's still the same score. It's try and avoid having a playoff in February. So that's that wraps things up in terms of what went on at Fulham and what went on in the press conference room at Fulham. Craven Cottage is, as I said earlier, it's a wonderful ground, but the press facilities, certainly the press room, it's way too small. It used to be a lot bigger. There used to actually be a bar in there when it resembled more of a hospitality lounge than a press conference room, but there was a certain warmth to it, and there was a working room separate to that. But the two rooms have been merged now, and it feels like it's a lot smaller. And certainly when there's a big game, and when Man United are in town, it's always a big game. It's pretty condensed, to say the least, and there weren't many chairs available. So that was not ideal for the press conference afterwards. But my colleague Tyrone Marshall spoke to Lisandro Martinez in the mix zone whilst I sat in on Amorim's press conference. So you can read all those lines. And Amorim was good value on other matters as well, beyond Rashford and Garnacho. He spoke about Rasmus Højlund as well, and I suppose to extend the analysis of Fulham, you look at the way it's going for Højlund, 11 games without a goal. The bugbear that I have with him is that you didn't have to watch him to know that he wasn't good enough to play for Manchester United. All you had to do was look at his goal-scoring record in 3 different countries. And that goal-scoring record is still relevant, because if we just look at it now, he got 5 goals in 32 games for Copenhagen, 12 goals in 21 games for Sturm Graz, which is pretty good going, and 10 goals in 34 games for Atalanta in Italy. So it was a modest goal-scoring record at best. Was it ever good enough to sanction a £64 million deal? No. Was that goal-scoring record screaming that this striker must be Manchester United starting striker? No. And sometimes it's that simple. You don't necessarily have to watch a player to know it. You just look at the background, you look at the age, you look at the profile, and he's not good enough. And Erik ten Hag, he tried to sell Højlund, and he did a reasonable job. And as the the great film critic Mark Kermode says, you always have to go in with an open mind. And so we went in with an open mind on Højlund, even though United had said that they wouldn't spend more than £60 million on him, which they did. They spent £64 million up front. And even though he had this modest goal-scoring record, and even though they wanted Harry Kane over any other striker, you think, okay, keep an open mind. But it's got to the point now where Manchester United matchgoers are becoming audibly exasperated with Højlund. We heard it during the Southampton game when he was starting. And what's been noticeable, as I've said in other podcasts, and Amorim has done this with Joshua Zirkzee as well, Højlund, during that game against Southampton, he lost a duel. Amorim turned around to his assistant, Carlos Fernandes, and said, get Joshua. And he had done that the other way around during the Bournemouth game when Zirkzee lost an aerial duel, turned around to Fernandes, said, get Rasmus. And Højlund came on that day. Zirkzee, of course, replaced Højlund at Fulham. Zirkzee doesn't look like scoring. Højlund doesn't look like scoring. The difference with Zirkzee is that he does keep the ball at least. And if you have the ball, you do have just by virtue of having it, you have a greater chance of scoring. Højlund, unfortunately, has next to no hold-up play. He was dropped for the FA Cup final in the run-in last season, and that demotion for the Newcastle game, I think it was, which was the penultimate Premier League game, that came on the back of a pretty anemic performance against Arsenal, and a story I did about certain United players being hesitant or certainly avoiding passing the ball to Højlund because they just had severe reservations about him. And there are United players in that squad who just don't think he's good enough. They'll be supportive of him publicly, of course, and Amorim was quite supportive of him yesterday as well. But he was also very honest, and he spoke of a disconnection between Højlund and the way the team plays. And Højlund was up against his international teammate in Joachim Andersen at Fulham. Andersen, of course, will know Højlund inside out, but Højlund should know Andersen inside out. But it didn't look that way, and you can't fault Højlund's effort. He gives his all. He's committed. He comes off the pitch every game with his kit muddied. At the moment, it's getting muddied because defenders are leaving him flat on his face in the turf because he's a pushover. He avoids duels as well, which is another problem. He does not want a physical confrontation with defenders. Certainly, while the game is in play, he did with Kyle Walker last month and came out of that with a fair amount of credit, given how risible Walker's reaction was to having his forehead grazed by Højlund. But the fact of the matter is, Højlund should never have been signed by United because he was too raw, he was unproven, and they needed a proven striker that summer. If Højlund was to have been signed by United, it should have been for a significantly cheaper sum and as a backup striker. And due to their poor planning and their lack of courage to test the waters with Tottenham and Daniel Levy for Harry Kane, they ended up with an unproven striker who really, what you see is what you get. And maybe he'll come good in time, but United don't have that time. They're in the bottom half of the table. They need a striker who is going to lead the line creditably, who's going to get them goals, who's going to take them up the table, and in the coming years try and help them become a credible force again. And that is not going to happen with Højlund. I would be happily proven wrong if it does, but it's pretty clear that he is one of many players in that squad who jar with Ruben Amorim's system. A little bit more housekeeping we'll try and get onto now regarding transfers and possible comings and goings. We've covered Rashford and Garnacho ad nauseum, of course. On Garnacho, Napoli have been looking actively at other targets. Adeyemi of Borussia Dortmund is another player who I wrote last week is of interest to Antonio Conte. Garnacho is not actively looking to leave United. It's really all on the club here, whether they decide that a club comes close to hitting or offering an acceptable fee for a player who was deemed unsellable only 6 or 7 months ago. So with Garnacho, I mean, even Amorim doesn't know if he's going to stay or go. I hope for United's sake Garnacho does stay. They need to keep him. It would look horrendously if he's allowed to go. People at the club think it's a bad idea if he's allowed to go. So that decision rests with the Brains Trust. It rests with Jason Wilcox and Omar Barada and whatever Sir Jim Ratcliffe says about him not having the final say or delegating to decision makers at the club, he of course will have a bear. And if he wants to keep Alejandro Garnacho at the club, Manchester United will absolutely keep Alejandro Garnacho at the club. Patrick Dorgu, it's gone very, very quiet on him. I was told that there was the meeting in Italy last week was so brief it might have actually lasted only 10 minutes. So there was a lot of noise about Dorgu last week. He came out of nowhere. Since then, it has gone very, very quiet. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if these deals, if these ins and outs that United would like to do come towards the end of the window or on deadline day. We've seen in the recent past that when push comes to shove, they can get deals done on deadline day and they can get a good deal done on deadline day. Marcel Sabitzer was an example of that. Christian Eriksen got injured against Reading in the FA Cup on Saturday. Within 24, 48 hours, United knew the extent of his ankle injury and how severe it was. And that meant that they had to do something on the deadline day on the Tuesday, I think it was. And they got Sabitzer in from Bayern Munich on loan for the remainder of the season. And Sabitzer did pretty well. He scored a few good goals. He was impressive in other games. He had a decent role coming on in the League Cup final, helping United close the game out. He could play as a central midfielder. He could play as a number 10 as well. And he did that a couple of times and was effective in that role. So that's an example that of Richard Arnold and John Murta overseeing transfer strategy and recruiting a very worthy player for Manchester United at the 11th hour of the transfer window. So if they can do it, there's no reason why the current hierarchy can't do it. And that's why it's such a huge week for Barada and Wilcox, two men who used to work together at City. Wilcox, it's a pretty interesting dynamic that's going on there, in that he was in charge of Southampton's recruitment this time last season. Look how well that's gone for one of the worst teams in the history of the Premier League. It's he's shopping in a very different avenue or boutique, if you like now, if United indeed had any money compared to Southampton last season. It's a very different profile of player that United want compared to what Southampton wanted. There's a lot of pressure on Omar Barada as well, given that he drove the move to hire Ruben Amorim. He took the initiative there. He wrested it from Dan Ashworth. Dan Ashworth was not pro Amorim whatsoever. He favoured Gareth Southgate or a British manager, which in retrospect you'd think, well, fair enough for United to decide he wasn't quite a suitable sporting director and they should get rid. But also, if you look at, speak to people who know how Ratcliffe operates, he is not shy of identifying a fall guy if he feels as though there's been a failure or a recent failure. And that was the feeling regarding Dan Ashworth's very sudden exit in early December. Things had gone so badly at the start of the season, they needed another fall guy after sacking Erik ten Hag. And it's not inconceivable that another fall guy could be identified if United have a poor end to the transfer window or if results continue to spiral, because you can't, as far as I'm concerned, you can't even contemplate changing coach again. That would be ludicrous. Ruben Amorim is absolutely not the problem at Manchester United. The problem are members of the hierarchy and the players. The players, too many of them are just simply not good enough. And that's why they're looking at someone like Tyrone Marshall and trying to move him on, whether he moves this year, this month, this transfer window, or in the summer. He's approaching the end game at Manchester United. He's got 18 months left on his contract, and I'm pretty certain that 1 year option on his deal will not be extended. So that does give United a little bit of leverage, looking a long way down the road somewhat, in that Malacia and Luke Shaw, the two senior left backs, and left back has been such a huge problem position for United in the past 18 months. Both of them, Malacia's out of contract next year. Shaw's out of contract the year after. So, things time goes by quickly in football, and who's to say United won't sell Luke Shaw before his contract's expiration date? But left back, you would hope for United's sake in a year or 18 months' time that they've got two different left backs in that squad. And there are other areas of the squad as well that need to be badly addressed, not necessarily this month, but certainly in the summer. Goalkeeper is another position that is very contentious at the moment. Andre Onana is still just about the number one. Yesterday at Fulham, he was on the halfway line, trying to position or set up an angle for a Bruno Fernandes free kick on the edge of Fulham's penalty area. He was practically like a caddy advising a golfer on what club he should use and what the wind was like. And I think Gary Neville said several years ago that he was always worried by Fabian Barthez because he always wanted to be involved, and Onana has certainly got a bit of the Barthez about him. He's trying too hard to be involved. Sometimes he's running into the opponent's half to celebrate United goals with players, teammates. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily. He's a good character. The players at in that dressing room get on well with him. He's a really lovely guy to talk to as well. Very personable, very amiable. I've chatted to him a few times now, and certainly after the first time, I thought, well, I really hope he does. He picks up now, and he did. That chat was in late February at the City Ground in the mix zone, just by the coaches there. It's quite a good mix zone at Nottingham Forest. Unfortunately, we got to speak to Onana that night, and he was doing well until December, and then he's had a pretty horrific 7 or 8 weeks in Golf United since that Arsenal game where he got cornered by Arsenal's corners. So a new goalkeeper is still needed in the summer, even if Onana has a serene end to the season, and maybe he will, and maybe he can change the dynamic. But the consensus at the moment among fans is not just they need a new goalkeeper in the summer, but I think a lot of fans were hoping that Altay Bayındır would start against Fulham. But we got the sense from speaking to Amorim on Thursday that he would bring Onana back in for that game. Maybe Bayındır will get another match between the sticks against FCSB in Bucharest on Thursday. I will not be making that trip. It'll be the first game I've missed this season. Is it charity? But I've charitably allowed Tyrone Marshall to take my plane ticket to Bucharest via Amsterdam and back. He'll be on a 5 to 6 flight on Wednesday morning, so I don't envy him too much in that sense. But I am starting to feel rather envious of going to what looks like a lovely city, and it's, of course, for a lot of my colleagues, it's an opportunity to visit another country that I'd imagine they've not been to before. There's a lot riding on the game as well. United need that positive result and performance to ensure that they progress to the round of 16 of the Europa League automatically and avoid that playoff in February. It would be against one of the other teams who finished between 9th and 24th. I mean, it's a perverse format that you could finish 24th in the table and you're still in a competition, but I think most of us gave up trying to work out UEFA some time ago. All they care about is making as much money as possible, and they don't really care about the products that they are selling to supporters or the workload that they're foisting onto the players as well, which is putting them nearly at breaking point, I think it's fair to say. But the month ends with a big game, as I said, against FCSB in Bucharest on Thursday night. It's 10 p.m. local kickoff time, so that's not great for my colleagues out there. I think they'll require a catnap in the afternoon to get through the evening, and then they've got early morning flights on the Friday ahead of Manchester United's first game of February this year against Crystal Palace on the Sunday. That's the 2 p.m. kickoff, and we'll discuss that more later on in the week. I think that's it for this first edition of the Samuel Luckhurst Show on the Manchester is Red podcast. Hopefully this has gone smoothly. Hopefully you've enjoyed this one-man show. Please, if you could, give us a like and a subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. And there'll be another podcast scheduled to be recorded later on in the week, maybe on Wednesday. Perhaps there'll be an audio dispatch from Tyrone in Bucharest, but we'll certainly have one on Friday on the eve of the Palace game, looking back at what happened in Bucharest. Thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye.